On the morning of March 3, 2026, a maintenance crew working along the face of Hoover Dam stopped what they were doing and stared at the canyon wall in front of them. They had seen the white scar before. Everyone who visits Lake Mead has seen it. That pale mineral crust coating the canyon walls wherever water once stood, a geological receipt, a permanent record of every foot of water that entered this reservoir and never came back. But the number they radioed in that morning was different. 140 feet. That is how far the white scar now stretches above the current water surface. Not 80 feet, not 100, 140. The height of a 14-story building now rising as empty air above a lake that was built to be permanent, designed to last centuries, and trusted by 40 million Americans who have never once questioned whether the water would be there when they turned on the tap. By noon that same day, Bureau of Reclamation officials confirmed what the maintenance crew had already seen with their own eyes. Lake Mead's elevation had dropped to 623 feet above sea level, the lowest sustained reading in the entire recorded history of the reservoir. Water managers across Arizona, Nevada, California, and 4 additional states received simultaneous briefings, emergency coordination calls activated between federal agencies. And the language used in those calls, according to sources familiar with the conversations, was not the careful, hedged language of routine bureaucratic updates. It was urgent. Something is happening to Lake Mead that the models did not fully anticipate, and the footage from that canyon wall is the most honest data anyone has seen in years. To understand what that white scar actually means, you have to understand where Lake Mead's water comes from. The Colorado River is not fed by underground aquifers or rising tidal exchange. It is fed almost entirely by snowpack, the snow that accumulates each winter across the Rocky Mountains of Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and northern New Mexico, and melts slowly through spring and early summer, sending water downstream into the river system that ultimately fills this reservoir. That snowpack system is collapsing. Researchers at Colorado State University analyzing snowpack data from 1950 through 2025 found that average snowpack across the upper Colorado River Basin has declined by 31% since 1980. Annual peak snowpack has dropped by 19% in just the last 12 years. But the detail that is sending water scientists into genuine alarm is not the volume. It is the timing. Warmer winters are causing snowpack to melt weeks earlier than historical averages. That earlier melt arrives before the river system's storage infrastructure is positioned to capture it. Water that was once held in frozen suspension across mountain elevations above 8,000 feet now runs off rapidly, evaporates at higher rates, and fails to translate into reservoir storage the way it did for the entire first half of the 20th century. The river that was supposed to fill this lake is delivering less water every single year, and the lake is showing exactly what that means. Here's the number that reframes everything. The Colorado River Compact of 1,922 legally allocated 16 million acre-feet of water annually between the 7 basin states. That allocation was the legal foundation on which cities were built, farms were planted, and development permits were signed across the American Southwest for the next 100 years. The actual average annual flow of the Colorado River since the year 2000 has been approximately 12.3 million acre-feet. The compact was written for a river that no longer exists at the volume it was measured. 4 million acre-feet of overallocation every single year, year after year after year. The math runs in only one direction downstream, toward an emptying lake, toward a dam whose intake systems are approaching minimum operational depth, toward a white scar on canyon walls that keeps climbing higher every time someone points a camera at it. The story of how this happened does not begin in 2026. It begins in 1922 on the banks of the Colorado River in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where representatives of 7 western states gathered to divide a river they barely understood. The negotiators used flow measurements taken during an unusually wet period in the early 20th century as their baseline. Tree ring studies and paleoclimate research now confirm that the river volumes measured between 1,900 and 1,920 represent some of the wettest years the basin had experienced in over 400 years. The 7 states divided a river at its historic high water mark and assumed that number was normal. It was not normal. Scientists studying long-term climate records describe what followed as a structural overcommitment baked into law before the concrete of Hoover Dam had ever dried. The dam itself was completed in 1935, celebrated as the definitive American conquest of Western aridity. It was designed to store 2 full years of average river flow as insurance against drought. At the time, that seemed like an overwhelming surplus. Nobody in 1935 modeled a drought that would last 26 consecutive years. The megadrought conditions now documented across the American Southwest by NASA, the United States Geological Survey, and universities across the region describe the period from 2000 to the present as the driest 23-year span in at least 1,200 years, possibly longer. The drought is not a temporary deviation from normal conditions. Scientists studying historical climate patterns now believe the drought may be the return of the actual historical normal, the baseline that the unusually wet early 20th century temporarily interrupted. Everything built on that wet baseline, the compact, the dam, the cities, the farms, the 40 million people was built on a miscalculation that nobody in power wanted to correct when correction was still manageable. By 2022, Lake Mead had dropped far enough to trigger Tier 3 shortage declarations under the Colorado River Compact, the most severe federal water restriction classification in the compact's history. That was supposed to be the crisis point, the signal that emergency conservation measures would reverse the trajectory. The bathtub ring measured at 140 feet on March 3, 2026 confirms that the reversal never fully arrived. Lake Mead at full capacity holds approximately 26.1 million acre-feet of water. On the morning the maintenance crew made their radio call, the reservoir held roughly 23% of that total design capacity. 23%. That number is not a projection. It is not a worst-case scenario from a climate model. It is the physical reality sitting behind Hoover Dam right now, visible to anyone willing to look at a canyon wall and count the feet of exposed rock between the waterline and the white scar above it. Put names and faces on that 23% and the scale becomes unbearable. In Las Vegas, Nevada, where 90% of the entire municipal water supply comes directly from Lake Mead, the Southern Nevada Water Authority has spent over $3 billion since the year 2000 on infrastructure designed to access water at progressively lower lake elevations. They drilled new intake tunnels deeper into the lake bed. They built low lake pumping facilities that did not exist in the original dam design. They implemented the most aggressive water conservation program of any major American city: mandatory restrictions, rebate programs to remove grass, tiered pricing systems designed to make waste expensive, and the lake still dropped 140 feet. Maria Gutierrez has farmed 40 acres in the Coachella Valley in California for 22 years. Her water rights trace back to an allocation agreement signed in the 1960s that guaranteed a specific volume each irrigation season. In 2024, she received 60% of her allocated water. In 2025, she received 51%. Her crop yields track those numbers directly. Her mortgage does not. The Navajo Nation faces conditions that expose the full moral weight of this crisis. 40% of Navajo Nation residents lack access to running water in their homes. They rely on hauled water, community collection points, springs and wells connected to the same overtaxed aquifer system beneath the Colorado River Basin. As that basin depletes, the options for those communities do not expand. They narrow. There is no alternative infrastructure waiting. There is no backup system in place. In Phoenix, Arizona, where growth projections through 2040 envision an additional 1.2 million new residents, city planners are running emergency scenario models that ask a question nobody wanted to be asking in 2026. What happens to a major American metropolitan area of 6 million people when its primary water source drops below operational thresholds? The models exist. The answers inside those models are not being shared publicly. But sources inside Arizona's Department of Water Resources describe growing alarm at the conclusions emerging from those simulations. The human cost of a failing Lake Mead is not theoretical. It is already accumulating, already destroying farms, already forcing tribal communities into impossible choices, already rewriting the economic futures of cities that were built on the assumption that the water would always be there because it had always been there before. But the crisis does not stop at the lake's edge. What most people watching footage of Hoover Dam do not understand is that the dam's most critical function is not holding water, it is generating electricity. The dam's 17 hydroelectric generating units produce enough power to supply approximately 1.3 million average American homes. That electricity flows into a grid serving Nevada, Arizona, and California. It powers hospitals. It runs water treatment plants. It keeps lights on in communities that have no immediate alternative generating source capable of replacing what Hoover Dam provides. Those generators require water pressure to function. As the lake surface drops, the pressure driving water through the dam's penstocks and turbines decreases. Less pressure means less generating capacity, and the relationship is not linear, it accelerates as the lake drops further. At 623 feet above sea level, where Lake Mead stood on March 3, 2026, the dam is generating at a fraction of its designed output. The minimum power pool elevation, the level below which the turbines cannot function at all, sits approximately 167 feet above the current water surface. Dr. Kevin Walsh, a civil engineer who spent 14 years working for the Bureau of Reclamation, reviewed the March 3rd footage and described the situation in terms he said he would not have used publicly 5 years ago. We are now within a realistic scenario window for dead pool conditions within this decade. Dead pool means the water level drops below the lowest intake elevation. The dam cannot release water downstream at all. The generators stop. The downstream flow that 7 states legally depend on simply ceases. Those 2 words, dead pool, are appearing in more official documents and scientific papers with each passing quarter. Section 4 of 4 words, 1501 to 2000. The failure of Lake Mead does not stay in Nevada. The moment the reservoir crosses critical thresholds, a cascade of consequences begins moving outward across the most economically productive agricultural region in the United States. The Imperial Valley of California produces more than 80% of America's winter vegetables. Lettuce, broccoli, carrots, spinach, melons. The produce aisles of grocery stores across the country in December and January are stocked almost entirely by farms drawing water from Colorado River allocations. When those allocations shrink below the level required to sustain that production, the consequences do not stay in California. They show up in every supermarket in every state in the country. Mexico holds treaty rights to 1.5 million acre-feet of Colorado River water per year under an agreement signed in 1944. That treaty represents an international legal obligation. As the river system collapses, the United States faces a scenario in which it cannot simultaneously honor domestic water allocations and international treaty commitments. The diplomatic consequences of that scenario are significant and almost entirely absent from public discussion. Lake Powell, the reservoir immediately upstream from Lake Mead sitting behind Glen Canyon Dam in northern Arizona, is experiencing its own parallel collapse. As of early 2026, Lake Powell had dropped to approximately 30% of capacity. The 2 reservoirs operate as a connected system. When Powell drops, it sends less water to Mead. When Mead drops, there is no downstream buffer left to absorb Powell's own deficits. The Colorado River Basin's dual reservoir system was designed with a combined storage buffer of nearly 50 million acre-feet. That buffer currently holds approximately 9 million acre-feet. The pipeline that was supposed to guarantee Western water security for a century has become a nearly empty vessel. In late February 2026, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration released its spring snowpack projections for the upper Colorado River Basin. Snowpack as of February 28th measured 62% of the long-term average across the critical headwater zones of Wyoming and northern Colorado. Winter precipitation deficits across the basin measured 41% below normal for the period from October through February. The forecast for the remainder of the season offers no indication of a pattern shift that could reverse the deficit before the spring melt window closes. Translation: the spring of 2026 will deliver less runoff than last year. Lake Mead will likely end the 2026 water year at a lower elevation than it began it. The Bureau of Reclamation is currently modeling 4 operational scenarios for the Colorado River system through 2030. 3 of those 4 scenarios project Lake Mead dropping below 1,000 feet of elevation within 36 months. The fourth scenario, labeled optimistic in internal documentation, requires 3 consecutive above-average snowpack years beginning immediately. The last time the Colorado River Basin recorded 3 consecutive above-average snowpack years was between 2000 and 2003. That was 23 years ago. The geology of the canyon walls around Hoover Dam does not negotiate. The white scar keeps climbing, the lake keeps dropping, and the window for managed orderly adaptation keeps narrowing with every snowpack report that comes in below average and every elevation reading that sets a new record low. The footage from March 3, 2026 does not show a natural disaster in the traditional sense. There was no earthquake, no hurricane, no single catastrophic moment that changed everything overnight. What the footage shows is the accumulated consequence of a century of decisions made by people who assumed the future would look like the past. Who built cities and deserts on the promise of a river that could not keep that promise forever? Who signed compacts and issued water rights and approved development permits again and again, while the snowpack quietly declined and the temperatures slowly climbed and the lake dropped 1 foot at a time? The Colorado River does not reach the Gulf of California anymore. It has not reached the sea consistently since the 1990s. It simply runs out, disappearing into agricultural fields and municipal pipes and evaporation long before it reaches where it was always supposed to go. 140 feet of white rock above a falling waterline is not a warning. The time for warnings has passed. It is a verdict, and 40 million people are still waiting to hear what comes next.